for joining us. Oh, darn it, I already did this afternoon. I'm in our series about human trafficking. My name's Allie Martinez, and I'm the chair of the Mid-Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force. And I'm joined today by Chief of Midland Police, Nicole Ford. Chief Ford, I'd love if you could tell us about yourself and the Midland Police Department.
Well, I'm always happy to talk about Midland Police Department. Myself, not so excited, but I've been in law enforcement for approximately 24 years. Most recently, I was down in the city of Flat Rock as the interim chief, which is closer to Ohio than anywhere else in Michigan at this point. I made my way up through the ranks, and I've been here with the city of Midland for approximately a year and a half. So for those that are doing the math, that was right about pandemic and flood time.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So it was an auspicious start. Midland Police Department, we have 50 officers. We cover everything from community resources, school resource officers, of course our patrol department. We have a full detective bureau, so we're a full service agency that can pretty much cover any need that you might have.
Yeah, so it was really sink or swim for you when you got here, right?
Absolutely.
Which was most of everybody for this last year has been a sort of sink or swim situation. And so I'm sure that you've encountered things in this last year in law enforcement that you probably have never encountered before.
Well, yes, being that, you know, there was a pandemic and a 500-year flood event, I got to encounter things not only have I not encountered in my career, but most other people have never encountered in their lives.
Yes.
So it was a heck of a trial by fire.
Yes, absolutely. And so we are here today to talk about human trafficking, which it can be argued the pandemic has exacerbated the problem, maybe exacerbated awareness. And so what do you think about when I say human trafficking?
Well, there's several different versions. I think the first thing that most people think of is the version of Taken, where they're overseas somewhere and they're abducted and then they're forced into the sexual slave industry, something along those lines. I think more often than not, what we see tends to be more of a domestic type situation where they know the person that they are serving ultimately in some shape or form. So it can be domestic servitude, it can be forced labor. You know, those are more of what we see versus the Taken version.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does law enforcement look at in terms of indicators? What have your officers been trained to look for?
So we actually look at it very similarly to pretty much any other case that we have. We try to take a good full focus view of what we're seeing. In a lot of ways, it looks like a domestic violence type relationship where you have that control oftentimes of finances or relationships, that type of stuff. And you really have to kind of dig into it to find out that they are there against their will, that it wasn't actually a domestic partnership, that it was a forced relationship.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess how often do you think that you're going to see that out in sort of the general public? I
would say most people probably would never see it, or if they saw it, wouldn't recognize it as such, because it can often look so commonplace and mundane, like, you know, a normal troubled relationship or whatnot. So I don't think most people would ever recognize it. I think when you live closer to more of a metropolis or a city with an airport where you get that transiency, then your chances would probably increase. You know, like it's not uncommon, our flight attendants will recognize something, you know, where things aren't adding up. But the everyday person, I don't know how much they would actually see it.
Right. So are your officers trained to look for indicators of human trafficking in their everyday jobs?
Yes, but I don't know so much, you know, law enforcement is always trying to keep up with what's new and staying on top of it. We, again, approach it like any other case where we ask what would often be viewed as invasive questions to try to get to the bottom of what we actually have going on there so that we have a full picture, so we know what crime is going on and what we could possibly charge with. So we do have some training with COVID, of course. We were scheduled for training and an outside organization was actually going to come in.
Okay.
But that got shut down once all of our buildings got shut down. So that'll be back on the front runner here pretty quick.
Okay. And so what does training look like as an officer?
So it can Generally, we like in-person training.
Yeah.
You know, I think we're all zoomed out at this point. So anything online, I think you lose a little bit. Whereas if you have someone standing in front of you and you can have that exchange of information, you just gather a lot more. So in my ideal world, we would have an organization come in. There's actually a state organization that had come in, initially wanted to come into each of our roll calls, so it would meet with each of our officers and just do like 15-minute segments. We also have a training program called Virtual Academy, which gives us access to 300 different classes, and it's all online. So it allows us to send a large amount of our officers to it and not have to worry about filling overtime and filling their space while they're gone, so that we're not short on the road, that kind of stuff. So we also have classes available through them.
Yes, and we all know from the last year how convenient virtual options can be in certain situations. But like you said, there's really just nothing like that in-person interaction, soaking that all in. And so you mentioned earlier some questions that law enforcement asks, the invasive questions, if you will. Can you give me some examples of a question that an officer might ask someone if they think they're in a situation?
So I would say that most of those questions would look a lot like if we were interviewing a domestic violence victim.
Okay.
You know, how long have you been in a relationship? You know, is this a sexual relationship, or, you know, are you roommates? Because those laws differ. So people are like, seriously, you're gonna ask me? That's really not your business. But that's the only way. We have to peel apart all the different layers in order to find out what's actually going on. So,
would officers be looking at people who might be in a labor trafficking situation as well?
Ideally, yes. We're fortunate here. We don't see a whole lot of it yet. It's something that we are still practicing looking for. Being that, you know, we don't have the casino here,
right,
or some of the other large venues where that would be more prevalent, we tend to get a little bit less. Whereas if you have some of those larger venues or a larger city, the opportunity is greater and it's easier to hide it because you have more people.
Yeah. Do you feel like there are instances where it seems kind of hidden in plain sight?
That is, I would say, is basically the definition oftentimes of human trafficking, is because it looks like everyday stuff.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so let's say that an issue of human trafficking has been identified. An officer has a hunch and asks the right questions and really seems to believe that this person is being trafficked. So what would be the next steps there?
So we would actually, we're very fortunate here in the city of Midland to have Shelter House. And Shelter House has far more resources for that type of crime and healing services than we do as a law enforcement agency. So we would reach out to them and get their advocates on board, and then also probably some therapy and that type of healing on board, so that we could get them to a better place, because it's really challenging when someone's a victim. They're living in that, and so to get them to answer questions fully, you know, you're trying to develop trust in a relationship and build on that so that you can get good full answers. So we would definitely reach out to Shelter House, and then also through Homeland Security, there's resources available. But with Shelter House right here in our backyard, we'd be silly not to use them.
Right, yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful to live in a community where you have those options and those resources. Would Homeland Security be a good resource for someone who might be experiencing labor trafficking and maybe wouldn't be eligible for services at Shelter House? Or
yeah, they could at least. One of the parts that I really liked about Homeland Security is they had a lot of resources available online. So certainly when you're like living with your captor, you're concerned about them finding out that you are even looking into this, online might be much easier than a phone call. So Homeland Security had actually a fair amount of information online for resources and whatnot. So for some, that might be an easier way to go regardless.
And what about the traffickers? I mean, we've talked a little bit about, you know, resources that are available for victims, but what would law enforcement, what would be the next steps for law enforcement if they identified someone as a trafficker?
Well, we would have to then be able to prove that as such and get charges through the prosecuting attorney, depending on the type of crime that it actually was. On the surface, we would either take them into custody or seek charges at that point, and then they would go through the judicial process just like everything else.
Right. Does Midland law enforcement, some regions and areas of the state, some people might be familiar with some of this stuff happening out of Genesee County with that ghost task force. Does Midland PD ever conduct any sort of stings or participate in any of those or receive training on what something like that would look like?
So I actually reached out to the sheriff on that program because once I saw that, I was very interested in it.
Yeah.
So that is something that we are interested in looking at. But again, it was literally about the month before we really started shutting everything down with COVID. So it would be back on the radar. Unfortunately, as with any other organization, we had all these goals and we kind of had to set some of them aside, and so now we're bringing them back to the front again.
Right, absolutely. And those, those goals were replaced by other goals, right? Law enforcement didn't just sit back and twiddle their thumbs for a year, I'm sure.
No. We joked that we had to put the biggest fire out first, and so we had to go for some other stuff first.
Yeah, definitely don't want to discredit any of the work that Midland PD has been doing just because it hasn't been necessarily a focus on human trafficking. But I know that there is a lot of interest, particularly on social media outlets, in this sort of vigilante effort in taking down predators or taking down child molesters or traffickers, because we know that sometimes they're one and the same. And so what would you say to the public or someone who wants to be a part of one of those vigilante efforts?
Please don't.
Why?
Because although often very well-intentioned, they don't understand how the criminal justice system works, the evidence that we are required to have. So with some of those efforts, evidence can actually be lost that could cost us a case. Yeah. So we much rather them find a way to channel that through their local law enforcement agency, through citizen academies or citizens on patrol, those types of things where that because we are always happy to have help. Any law enforcement agency will tell you that, but we want to make sure that it's done in a way that is beneficial versus harmful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so it can be easy for the general public to sometimes feel frustrated by these injustices that they believe are taking place. And so your recommendation would always be to reach out to local police if you think something's happening?
Absolutely, yes. Fortunately, we have a full-service 911 center that's on 24/7, so we can always get you an officer or a supervisor to answer questions and kind of send you in the right direction. It's just way more efficient that way, and we don't risk losing a case by a well-intentioned individual, because we also don't want to scare off the captor possibly and have them relocate the victim, and then that poor victim has to start all over and hope that somebody else notices.
Right.
Whereas this way, if they notice something, then we can start looking at it while they're still here.
Yeah, especially early on in this human trafficking movement, right? Human trafficking has existed for as long as eternity, right? But we've since kind of picked it up as a buzzword, and a lot of the time in the beginning it was the see something, say something element, and people didn't know who to say something to. People didn't know, I feel like something's not going on or is going on over there, but maybe it's not a 911 emergency. And so I think it's helpful to know that you can just reach out to your local police department and speak with someone and be able to, describe what you think is happening so that they can kind of look into it a little bit deeper.
So we actually, I think that's one of kind of the misnomers of 911. I would say probably when we were younger, it was like, only call 911 if it's a complete emergency. Otherwise, you'd call the non-emergency number. 911's not really treated that way anymore. We much rather you call 911. In fact, if you were to call our station and get my office, where my administrative assistant answers, she would actually tell you hang up and call 911, because then it goes through the process. It gets recorded, your location comes up, all of the things that are the benefits of a 911 system. So we actually prefer, we get calls all the time, I'm not really sure what this is, and then they'll help discern it and send an officer out, and we'll go from there. So 911 is, you're welcome to call 911 whenever you like, versus trying to find the non-emergency number. Or is this really a big enough emergency? We don't want all that. Just call us and we'll come out and help you.
Yeah, and that's excellent information, because I do feel like that happens is people get frustrated with, well, I don't know who to call, so I'm just not going to call anybody.
I just won't.
Yeah. That's excellent information. So call 911 if you ever suspect anything's happening in your community. And then I guess probably the overall frustration that people experience is when abuse is happening to a child, right? That's going to always impact anybody who's involved, anybody who sees it or witnesses it. And so how would a child case differ from an adult case of suspected human trafficking?
So, well, as by definition, a child cannot consent to sexual activity. So if there's any sexual activity whatsoever, then it becomes, in that type of a scenario, it automatically jumps to a human trafficking. Whereas an adult, that there's more things that we have to be able to look at. But oftentimes for kids, we get referrals through schools or neighbors or relatives, and they'll call CPS, Child Protective Services, or Department Health and Human Services, depending, and then we will get a referral, at which point we will start the investigative process. So that's, I would say, probably the largest difference is, you can't call CPS generally and report on the behalf of an adult.
Right, absolutely. There's some autonomy there once you turn 18. But you're saying that suspicion of child abuse or child trafficking would be handled via the CPS services or what we would expect from a child abuse type case.
Absolutely. It would look very similar, because it probably wouldn't be well until we were in the investigation that we would discover that it was actually more of a human trafficking than a straight up child abuse. So that's the challenge, I would say, with this law and this crime, is that you often don't realize that that's what's really in front of you until you kind of start to dig in and get the details a little bit more.
Yeah. And do you think that the indicators might look different for a child versus an adult case?
Well, yes, because it's how they would control how the captor would control that scenario would look very differently. So as an adult, they might control the finances or who you get to speak to. Whereas with children, you don't have to do that, because you can have physical control over them a little easier. So I would say it would kind of look different that way. Yeah.
Do you think there are additional risk factors that someone might look into, like a runaway child or a child who's in foster care? Or do you think that there's additional risks that children face that maybe adults wouldn't, and that would be, I don't know if they'd be easier to identify, but something that law enforcement would be looking at when dealing with a child?
I think so. Just pure size alone opens up the vulnerability. But beyond that, it is, we have vulnerable populations throughout our communities that are more apt to have this occur, because criminals look for victims. They don't necessarily just pick who's in front of them. They intentionally choose who they are based on the type of crime that they're doing, and can they control that person the way that they need to. So undocumented workers, people that wouldn't want to report it because they would be afraid that they would be found out that they are here as an undocumented. Probably your sex trade workers in general, prostitution. Our prostitutes aren't generally running to come to the police department to report things that are occurring to them. Yeah. So runaway children, because they don't have a network at home generally that they can reach out to as a support system. So those, just like a lot of crimes, captors will look for those type of individuals that are already vulnerable because they don't have the support systems that some of us have.
So they're not looking for them at the grocery store to stuff into their trunk, or how does that
Well, I will
work?
never say never. I have taught my daughter that's what will occur.
Yeah.
Because you do still need to be worried about that. Kidnappings still do occur for adults and for children, but I don't think that's probably the large majority of what, if we were able to document this information coherently, that we would be seeing. I think that's far less. Just like when we were coming up through high school and whatnot, we were talking about safety, personal self-defense for women and worrying about being raped. Well, raped coming up initially was there was a man lurking in the bushes and he was going to take you and do bad things to you. Well, and then we find out rape is actually so many other things. It's a date rape and that type of stuff. So I think it's a matter of changing the perceptions that's out there, and part of that is just educating people that there's just so many more other versions of this versus what they see on television.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Do you believe that we have human trafficking here in our community?
Absolutely. I mean, I would love to tell you that we are immune to such a thing, but I think we have every crime here in Midland. It's just how prevalent is it? How large of a problem is it? Every city has the same problems. It's just to what degree.
Yeah, and so having said that, if I'm a resident of Midland City, the community as a whole, what can I be doing to combat this or to call it out?
I think one of the biggest things is to just pay attention. I think in the world that we exist with all the social media, we've gotten so used to just kind of getting to know people on the surface, whereas we used to know our neighbors. We used to know their names. We knew their kids' names. So pay attention to comings and goings. And that doesn't mean you have to be peeking out your window, but you should know what goes on in your neighborhood, and you should know your general neighbors that surround you. And then from there, when in doubt, report. I think people so often I just don't want to get involved, or they wait, and then we'll arrive and they'll tell us, well, I noticed this about 5 days ago, and we're like, well, 5 days ago would have been really beneficial for us, So I think people are just really hesitant to get involved, and we much rather err on the side of caution, come out and have it be absolutely nothing. That's a way better day than to have had it sit there. Well, I thought it was weird about a month ago, and then now that person's been going through that much longer undetected.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything else that you'd like to add on the subject?
Not really. I would just welcome anybody that, when in doubt, feel free to reach out to us. We will get you answers, and we have no problem following up. And again, we much rather be ahead of it than behind it. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chief Ford, for joining us today, for all that excellent information around human trafficking. And I think that one of the biggest takeaways that we can take from this discussion is if you suspect anything, 911 is the route to take. And so thank you for joining us for this segment on human trafficking today. And there are additional resources that you can always look into. PolarisProject.org is probably one of the best national resources, and they're who run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and that number will be on your screen soon. You can also contact the Midland City Police Department if you have any additional questions, and you can visit the Mid-Michigan Human Trafficking Mid-Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force page on Facebook if you'd like to look for more and additional information on what is going on in human trafficking in our region. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.